For at least a generation, the Weatherford Hotel has been recognized as a world-class lodging and entertainment complex and the anchor of Flagstaff's historic downtown district. Seeing it in its current state, next to photos from its early years, it looks like it's been kept in pristine condition. However, this is far from the case. Fewer and fewer Flagstaff residents remember the rundown state of downtown prior to the rehabilitation that took place in the late 80s and early 90s. It's important to look not only at the building's early grandeur and its current status as a historic landmark, but also at the middle years, which span the majority of the building's life so far and are characterized by struggle, uncertainty, and perseverance. The first great era of the hotel ended in the late 1920s when the Depression hit, the balcony burnt down, the Weatherford family lost ownership of the hotel, and the more modern Monte Vista Hotel opened nearby. Various hardworking owners and managers kept the Weatherford afloat, and even in its reduced state, it was an important meeting place in our small community. A surprising amount of businesses and organizations called the space home during this time. As Art Deco and then modernist architecture came into vogue, the facade of what is now the Exchange Pub changed to conform to then current tastes, and various so-called improvements ramped up in the post-war era as fireplaces were sealed up and large rooms were divided to create more spaces to rent out to satisfy the growing number of visitors to Flagstaff. By the 1950s, the hotel portion of the building was suffering, and we first started to see ads for weekly and monthly rental of the rooms. While crime was always an occasional concern, it also seems to have ramped up in the hotel during this time. Much has been written elsewhere about the downfall of American downtowns in response to things like shopping malls and the growth of suburbs, and former NAU professor Thomas Paradise's book, Themetown, is a great resource to see exactly how this happened in Flagstaff. When Henry Taylor took over ownership of the hotel, along with his brother Lloyd, the building and the area surrounding it were in sorry shape. Previously owned by the Babbitt Brothers Spur and Cattle Company, the building would reportedly have been bulldozed and the lot turned into a parking lot if the Taylors had not stepped in. Henry and Lloyd grew up in the historic Arizona Rancho Hotel in Holbrook, and Henry had moved to Flagstaff to be a social worker, so the brothers combined their areas of expertise by utilizing the rooms to house clients in recovery as they worked to learn job skills, all the while the Taylors refurbished the building step by step. For the first few years, Henry and Lloyd traded off 12-hour shifts in the hotel, while Henry also ran a boot shop in the basement where a cobbler taught his trade to vocational rehab clients. This kept up the mortgage payments, but the pace of work wasn't sustainable in the long term. Henry and Lloyd's mother, still running the Arizona Rancho in Holbrook, had opened the first hostel in the state of Arizona, so the brothers were familiar with this new concept that was mostly targeted to European and Japanese tourists. This was a perfect fit for the Weatherford, as foreign visitors were used to the small rooms and antiquated facilities. Meanwhile, in 1977, they opened Charlie's, a cafe named for Lloyd's brother-in-law, Charlie Spinning, and they started hosting performances by various theater groups, as well as art exhibitions. Variations on this setup continue to this day. In 1979, the Flagstaff Mall opened on the east side of town, which did nothing to help the exodus of businesses from the downtown area. But that same year, the Taylors achieved a major goal, which was to get the building on the National Historical Register. It was the very first structure in Flagstaff to achieve this feat. This designation meant that while the hotel was still far from profitable and the building needed millions of dollars of work to get it back to its former glory, it would be very difficult for anyone to have it demolished, even if the Taylors' other endeavors didn't end up working out. The early 1980s were eventful, as the hostel flourished and Charlie's Pub's weekly blues night brought wholesome fun back to the seedy downtown bar scene. Also, Pamela Sam Green, an art student from Ohio, would marry Henry and eventually buy out Lloyd's share of the business. Around the same time, just as things appeared to be on the upswing, tax problems emerged and the Weatherford's very existence was once again in jeopardy. Thankfully, at the very last minute, the hotel successfully filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, keeping it, at least for now, under the Taylors' ownership. At the same time, Sam and Henry moved into the hotel with their infant daughter Chelsea so that they could put all of their focus on running the business and renovating the building more quickly. As the 80s made way for the 90s, a sense of stability came to the Weatherford, as well as the rest of downtown Flagstaff. Due to Henry and Sam's hard work, the hostel operations were phased out in favor of operating as an actual hotel again. In the late 1990s, the Zangray Bar and Ballroom was opened, followed quickly by the grand opening of a balcony, replacing the one that had been destroyed by fire almost 70 years before. On New Year's Eve, going into the year 2000, exactly a century after the hotel's grand opening, the Taylors began the tradition of dropping a giant pine cone. Further improvements have taken place, and in the last few years, under the leadership of Taylor's daughter, Chelsea, the Weatherford has more going on than ever before. Like Disneyland, the hotel is never finished, but in a constant state of evolution. To bask in over 120 years of history and maybe have a beer alongside Sam and Henry, be sure to stop in next time you're in Flagstaff.